Thank you. Globally, it is estimated that nearly 3 in 10 women may have experienced physical violence by age 15. Gender-based violence is one of the most prevalent human rights violators in the world, and it knows no national, ethnic, social, economic, or status barriers. According to the Nigerian National Demographic Health Survey, NDHS, the incidence of gender-based violence is rising astronomically in the country, sadly, especially more in the insurgency-affected areas where the statistics are alarming. These acts of violence range from early marriages to physical, mental, or sexual assault on women and sometimes men. They also result in all manners of vile consequences, among which are rape, unwanted consequences, VVF, popularly called again fistula, physical or psychological damages. According to the UNFPA, and I quote, "Gender-based violence undermines the health, dignity, security, and autonomy of its victims, yet it remains shrouded in a culture of silence." Victims of violence, usually women and girls, are already vulnerable from their status. Among these are internally displaced persons, IDPs, or other vulnerable groups. Beyond that, they face intimidation, discrimination, and sometimes stigma, and therefore have no voices in the society. And that's what we'll be examining today on Bridges. And with me in the studio are ladies who themselves are advocates, activists, and wanting to lend a voice to what we see today and speak to as gender-based violence. So we're speaking to the fact that it does happen, really, that we have a problem with it, and that we need to speak to it. Okay, let's start from you. What is the experience of Ghana since, well, you are holding this office?
We are trying to replicate a model that has already happened in Lagos, where we have a coordinated response of sexual and gender-based violence, and we want to see how we can replicate that in as many states as we can, basically bringing together the police, the law enforcement, the Ministry of Health because of the Hospital Management Board, the Women Affairs because of counseling, and also Ministry of Justice because of the judicial aspect of it, bringing them all together so they work in a coordinated
So
manner.
what we are saying is that it does exist.
Of course, yeah, it does exist.
And let's hear from FIDA, who has been in the forefront of at least meeting with some of the victims. What has been your experience?
FIDA right now will be going around schools as well to sensitize the girls in the school to know their rights against violence so that they will be able to speak out whenever it happens to them. And we have a lot of cases of violence coming in.
What kind of cases?
We have a lot, but let me just cite one. We have one violence against a little girl who the father remarried, and the baby was just barely 2+, and the little girl can speak a little, and each time the father leaves this child home, when the mother died when the child was 7 months old, and the father was taking care, he never allowed the child to go to the family. He said he wants to take care of the child himself, and the child has been with him. He had people to help him out with the baby. Later, he discovered that he cannot cope alone, so he decided to marry. He remarried and have a wife who was with him. Each time he goes to work, by the time he comes back, the little girl will see bruises, wound on the baby's body.
That's physical, right?
Physical assault on that baby. And the worst of it was that the little girl fell. Don't know what actually happened, but we discovered that they hit something on the child's head, and the child was paralyzed.
No.
I think from the hand, from head to the leg. He could not move his hand, she could not move the leg, and the child was taken to the National Hospital. And the National Hospital, the nurse said,
Are you following up the case?
The girl has to go up the surgery, brain surgery. When we got there, we asked the little child. She was in the baby cot. And we called her name, and she said, "So what happened to you?" She said, "My auntie," and that's the father's wife, hit my head, and We said, Auntie Joy, how are you feeling now? Say you cannot move. She couldn't move both hand and leg. So later fortunately for us, the lady walked in. So the father's wife walked in and said, is this the auntie? She couldn't say anything anymore. She could not say. I'm sure she must have threatened her that if you say, I'm going to smack you the more. So the baby could not tell us.
How old is this girl?
She should be between 2, 3.
Are you is FIDA following up?
Yes.
Thank you. At least there'll be some respite for that, some measure of justice for that girl. We would on Bridges also follow up with you. Ma'am, let's hear from you.
Let me mention a case that we successfully secured a conviction for the rapist. But we actually wanted to appeal because we felt that the punishment was too small. What happened, the man tricked the girl into his house, asked the girl to come and help him to clean his house. The girl got there on a Friday. The man locked up the door, removed all she wore to the house, soaked in a pail of water from Friday to Sunday, and was sexually abusing the girl. He didn't stop at that. He shaved the girl's hair under the armpit, under her private, on her head. So they call him FIDA. And thank God for the chairperson. She was very smart. Immediately she called me and said, no, anything I am doing now, I should drop it, I should come. So I ran to the secretariat. We moved. As we were going out, they were taking the suspect in a cab. The police were taking the suspect in a cab. So we now followed them. So at the end of the day, we got that man, and they took the matter to area court.
Oh no.
An offense like that. Anyway, the judge, the magistrate, city magistrate was kind enough. We told him it's extrajudicial, it's beyond him. He should just strike out the case and let's start afresh in a court of jurisdiction. And that was what we did. We went to Federal High Court. We secured conviction. He was jailed for 2 years. He's still there. So we are trying.
And how's the girl?
The
Rehabilitating the victim. Yeah. That's one thing we don't speak to. Because that girl has been psychologically abused, apart from the physical abuse that she went through. Now, I'll come to you. Do you have further statistics? Let's make it real. This thing is happening. What has been your experience?
The U.S. government's strategy to support the Nigerian government's efforts to, prevent and respond to gender-based violence is sort of holistic and multi-sectoral, right? And it's interagency, so it's not just the USAID, but also including the U.S. State Department. And the whole idea is to build local capacity and expertise to be able to both identify, prevent, respond, and rehabilitate survivors and victims of gender-based violence. So I would say, like you said, the statistics tells us that this is a real problem. We could start, for example, by looking at the different forms of violence that exist. So physical violence, for example, you quoted right when you started the program by saying at least 3 in 10 women would have experienced some form of physical violence before the age of 15. And with intimate partner violence, which is a really common form of gender-based violence these days, it's almost 1 in 3 women would have experienced some form of violence from a partner or an ex-partner or ex-boyfriend or current boyfriend. It doesn't necessarily matter that you're married, for as long as there's some sort of partnering happening between the man and the woman. Child marriage is another form that is really a big deal. We have 49% of Nigerian children married before they're 18 years, and about 17% of these are married before they're even 15. What that tells, Nigeria contributes, I think, the largest number of child brides ever across the world. So that in its own also, of course, brings its own consequences of children being forced out of school to get married, and exposes them to increased incidents of violence because they're, disadvantaged. They're young. They have no idea what, to expect in a marriage. They're being forced into marrying someone who is far older. And so many of them don't even know what their rights are. So they can't necessarily protest when things are going wrong. So I think we could tell from all of this data that, you know, and across
yeah,
different
I actually
forms
have some data here from some of the findings of USAID, and it says 571 cases of sexually gender-based violence were reported to USAID through Pathfinder from the sexual assault referral centers in Niger, Akwa Ibom, Enugu, Kaduna, Kano, Jigawa, and of course Lagos between May and September 2018. That is a huge, that is the reported cases.
I think beyond the sexual one, there's the one that we don't even pay attention to. That's the emotional violence. A lot of women go through that day in, day out, and there's nobody to talk to. And I think when last year was the year for women to speak out, I don't think we got much response from women in that respect, because the emotional one traumatizes people. I know a woman who went through trauma 12 years ago, and in the 12th year she started showing post-traumatic stress disorder. Fortunately, she met with a doctor who could identify that she had been traumatized behind. Just imagine that it's your regular doctor who doesn't have any experience in that line. They just take it that there was nothing wrong with the woman, and she has been going around with that body. So the ones we don't even pay attention to is the post-trauma that even traumatizes people more, and the emotional trauma they have to face for years. That's the one that I think we should also pay attention to beyond the physical one.
We need to go beyond GBV. We need to actually go into the system. A lot of things are going on, and when it explodes, it will be an alarm. Go to offices now. I'm sorry I have to say this. Most women have turned themselves to monsters, especially the senior women in the offices. The graduates that are working under them, they have enslaved them. Once they get their files and they see that they are more qualified than them, they will do everything to frustrate. It's so traumatizing. A child that has passed through education for years, only for her to be seen being traumatized. There was one that almost slapped. She didn't know I am a social justice advocate. Aside feeder, I have a foundation. She didn't know who I am. I was standing behind the two of them, because the girl, she almost slapped that girl. You see, it's so bad. We are talking of, what about violence of women against women?
But another one that we
Then violence of mistresses against their house girls.
Violence against boys. Boys, yeah, because that one goes much, you know, the people don't really recognize that, and it does happen. It happens. They are mostly sodomized when it comes to sexual violence, and even the physical violence against boys is taken for granted. It's taken as part of discipline and so on. I mean, there was a recent case of a school, again in the northern part of Nigeria, where a lot of boys were sodomized by their, you know, staff. You know, so those kind of things are very traumatic.
I think because we don't actually speak out, and because discussing sexuality in the open in Nigeria is still something that we all shy away from, and it is happening. And we've spoken to the physical one. There's a trend that is so heartbreaking when you have parents, actually fathers, who actually have incest with their girls. And of course, these days then you read about young babies, 3-month-old, 1 year, 2 years, who are physically and sexually abused. What exactly, what should we be doing? Are we not speaking enough? Are we, what's happening?
I had a case, I had to cleverly wriggle out of it. It was very serious. The moment the father slept with that girl, the girl went away. She went mad. But by the time I got to that spot, I saw her chained to the bed. When they could not control the situation, they had to take her to the hospital. Now, I was so annoyed. I wanted to take it up. But lo and behold, you know, women, that's why I said we should discuss it. The mother was begging that if we make noise about it, the man will be dismissed from the job. Ma, what do you do about that?
So when we say gender-based violence, what do we truly mean? We're talking about violence that is perpetrated against someone
who is vulnerable.
by virtue of the person's biological sex, gender identity, or just because there are some socially defined norms about femininity and masculinity, and that person is sort of seen as straying away from those norms, right? So I think that sort of covers the boys that we're talking about earlier. So if the violence is against you just because you're a boy versus you're a girl, then, you know, the term gender-based violence sort of really. But talking to the point around being shrouded in secrecy, shrouded in, you know, cultural norms and all of that, is our approach to this response really needs to be comprehensive. You need to look at the prevention piece of it, and in doing prevention, you have to look at the men and the boys. You have to look at women, you know, the older women, look at institutions, look at the religious institutions, look at the media, look at, you know, all of those key players, and CSOs, FIDA, everyone needs to be involved, right? I think the key word for me in prevention is making people understand that this is not cultural, it's criminal.
It's criminal.
It's
yes,
criminal.
exactly.
The more people understand that this is not cultural, this is not about your husband being dismissed, this is not about my brother.
It is a crime.
It is a crime. That mentality needs to switch. It is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against whoever is the victim. That way, it's easier to then begin to articulate and bring, you know, everyone together, sort of take the role they need to take, addressing the situation. So I think the prevention needs to be really robust.
Yes, and that goes back to the issue of the cultural norms, the social norms in the household. You know, we as parents have to take responsibility to teach our children and our wards the right kind of,
if,
you know,
I mean, if the parents that we look up to actually mold, the children, are they themselves the perpetrators?
Exactly.
Yes, I think building a steady bridge here should be, you know, one that will take up from this program, is that women themselves should encourage the criminalization of this abuse, because women, you know, see what happened to Ochaya, for example. I mean, there was a woman in the house. Her son, her husband were involved in sexually abusing. Yes,
she must
and for over the years, you cannot convince us to say over the period of 4 or 5 years going that you didn't see any change in the girl. So the area where you spoke to, I think, is germane. And we on Bridges, I'm sure together with you women, that we are calling at, and that's why it's on an all women participant we have today on Bridges, that we need as women to take this up more seriously. You must watch that ward. You must watch that child. Invariably, they come back to us when they are hurt or, yes. It's to the mother. It's you who would eventually say it. But why weren't you looking out before it happened? If you see any trace, you... And
even teaching the signs, you know, teaching them good touch, bad touch, how to look at, and being open, you know, not because we have a culture of children not being able to approach the parents, you know, so you need to break that barrier for the sake of your girl child, so that she can talk to you when she's facing some issues.
And if I could tie that up a little, is you know, we talked about underreporting as a major issue, right? Because I mean, we have data, but we know that we can't trust the data because we feel people are not reporting. And you made a good point about, you know, sexual education for children. I think for me, it starts from basic primary school, when a child at 6-year-old is comfortably able to talk about parts of her body and is able to talk very well about her eyes, her nose, but then when it comes to reproductive health organs, it's all shrouded in private parts. So when in reporting, you know, she says someone touches my private part, you're not sure what she means by uncle touch or auntie touch my private part, right? So I think that's where you really need to start breaking the ice around conversing around certain conversations. The minute she's able to report accurately that this person touched A or B or C part of my body, you know, and like she said, that person she's talking to is her mom or her aunt who she can trust, then you're building the kind of intergenerational communication that is needed.
Yes. There was a song I taught them, my breast, my bums, my private part, my breast, my bums, my private part, my breast, my bum, my private part, nobody must touch it.
Thank you. I'll just stop you from there, and let's share a true life experience for about a minute before we come back about a survivor of a gender-based violence. She will quickly just say something to us. Thank you for coming on Bridges.
I was 9. When my brother-in-law started raping me, and it continued till I was 12. It started one day when I went into his room to get an item for another uncle staying in the house with me. And I don't know, maybe he was up to something already, because when I walked in, he was a bit agitated. Then he said I should come and lie down on the bed, and I did. I complained because I didn't understand what he was trying to do, but he told me it wouldn't be painful and I could close my eyes and not notice what he was doing. So when he pulled down my pants and did what he had to do, my eyes were closed quite all right, and it was painful. It wasn't what he said it would be. So when I stood up, I told him that it was painful, and he said I shouldn't tell anyone, that he will boil water, rub me down, and all that. It continued on and off every night for, like I said, 3 years. So I was like 12 when I got the courage to actually stand up to him and tell him one night that if he touched me, I would scream. And I only got that courage because there was an adult in the house with me who noticed what he was doing, and he was my elder brother. And he asked me what was happening every night, that he noticed whenever they are in the room together, this man always leaves the room, and he doesn't know where he goes to every night. And I said that he comes to my room. And my brother was like, what does he do? I didn't say anything. I kept quiet. So he said, next time he comes to your room, I want you to scream and call me. And when he did come again, I told him that I was going to scream if you touched me. And he said, why? And I told him why. So he backed off and said if I ever told anyone, no one would believe me, and that he would deny it. And he was right. By the time I turned 30, early 30, 32 actually, I had the courage to actually speak up and tell my sister. But my sister didn't believe me. She said I was lying. The sad thing is that it's been years. I should have gotten over it. I know I should. Somehow I've been able to manage myself to this point. But I'll be lying if I say that I've actually gotten over it, because I have not. I can't stay in the same room with a man. I've come close to getting married so many times, and I've walked away, not because they were bad people, but because I couldn't see myself sleeping on the same bed with them. So it has defined me. I don't want to say define who I am, but it has actually influenced what I've become. I don't have a life. I wish I could get married and have kids, but I can't. And
thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that experience that we've shared, and that goes to show the reality of what we are talking about, that gender-based violence in all its ramifications happens: physical, emotional, traumatic, name it, psychologically, name it, and of course the big one, the sexually abused people. But one word, how do we build a permanent bridge to contain it? We know we can't definitely stop, but containment.
We need to look at each other's children as part of us.
Thank you, ma'am.
That's it. Love our children so that they will tell us whatever problem they are going through.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So prevent, protect those who have survived or who have been victims, and hold people accountable to their actions.
Yes.
If you see something going wrong, it depends on you to come out and say it, so that they can be nipped in the bud.
I think for me it's about making sure all the government institutions are responsive to gender violence, so that, you know, perpetrators are brought to justice and they know that they cannot get away with it.
Yes. I think I agree with every suggestion that has been made, and I'm sure that we can actually build a solid bridge across what we see today and make our tomorrow better, particularly for the children. And if you know anybody there, that even if you can't speak to us as a person, you can call these numbers on the screen That way, we'll be helping to curtail, to contain, and to give an assured future to our children. Thanks for watching, and thanks for coming on Bridges. We will continue with this conversation. It's not over yet, is it?
No.
Okay, so the narrative will continue. We'll be back again on Bridges same time next week. And remember, we're still working to build a sustainable society.
Thank you.